My name is Claire Donovan, and I'm 29 years old. For 12 years, my family looked at me the way you look at a chair with a broken leg. Still in the room, but something you work around, something you quietly stop trusting. I was the daughter who dropped out of her second year of university, who rented a different apartment every 18 months, who showed up to Christmas dinner with hollow eyes and excuses that never quite held their shape. That was the version of me they knew. That was the version they chose to believe. And for reasons I am only now able to explain, I let them. It started when I was 19. My father, Robert Donovan, was the kind of man who respected one thing above everything else: a title. He worked as a senior operations director for a shipping company and wore that identity the way some men wear cologne. Everywhere, always, even when it wasn't necessary. My mother, Patricia, was gentler in her disappointment, but no less present in it. She had imagined a daughter who became a nurse, maybe a school counselor, something she could describe in one clean sentence to the women at her book club. What she got instead was me, a girl who packed a single bag at 19 and left without a forwarding address and came back with nothing they could point to. What no one in my family knew, no one except my Aunt Lorraine, was that 3 weeks before my 20th birthday, I had been hired by a private agency contracted to a federal department I was not permitted to name out loud. The work was sensitive in ways I could not explain and was never expected to. My supervisor had told me plainly during my first week that a low profile was not a suggestion. It was a condition of the job. So I became, entirely by design, the family disappointment, the one Patricia lowered her voice about when relatives asked questions, the one Robert had stopped looking directly at somewhere around year 5, as if sustained eye contact with failure might be contagious. The years moved quietly. I worked across 3 different cities. I built a life that was real in every way that mattered, except in the one way my family could measure. When I came home for visits, twice a year, sometimes only once, I wore unremarkable clothes and answered questions with other questions and watched my father's jaw go tight whenever someone mentioned my name in conversation. My mother started slipping folded cash into my coat pocket when I left. 50s, sometimes hundreds, tucked in without a word. She thought I was surviving on nothing. I never corrected her. It wasn't cruelty. It was the agreement I had made, and I kept it even on the nights when keeping it felt like holding something very heavy with both hands and nowhere to put it down. The one exception was Aunt Lorraine. She was 74 years old and had the kind of sharp, patient intelligence that never announced itself. She had figured me out somewhere around year 3, not because of anything I had told her, but because of everything I hadn't. She said to me once, over tea at her kitchen table, that nervous people talk too much to fill the silence, but people carrying something real go very still. She said I was the stillest young woman she had ever watched. After that conversation, I stopped pretending with her. I couldn't give her details, but I gave her enough that she understood the shape of things. She never breathed a word of it to anyone. She just watched me with those steady, knowing eyes every time I visited and held my hand at the door when I left, like she was proud of something the world hadn't given her permission to say. That was my life. That was the arrangement. I had made peace with it in the practical way you make peace with something that you cannot change. Not happily, but thoroughly. Then, on a Wednesday evening in early November, my phone lit up with a message from Aunt Lorraine. It was a grocery list. That doesn't sound like much, but Aunt Lorraine had not sent me a grocery list in 9 years. Not since I'd shown her, during a quiet afternoon visit, the simple phrase-based signal system I sometimes used in low communication situations. I had taught it to her almost as a way to feel close to something I could never fully share with her. She had laughed and written it down carefully on the inside cover of a small notebook. I had assumed honestly that she'd forgotten all about it. The list read, milk, the good bread, butter, eggs. 6, not 8. 6, not 8. That was the phrase. That was the signal. It meant, something is wrong. I need you. Come now. Don't call ahead. I was out of my apartment in under 5 minutes. I called in a welfare check to the local dispatch as I drove, gave the address, kept my voice level and clear, and asked for a unit to meet me. My parents' house, where Aunt Lorraine had been staying since August following a fall, was 31 minutes away. I ran every minute of the drive. I pulled up to the house alongside 2 officers. The lights were on. My father's car was in the driveway. The front windows were closed. Everything looked the way it always looked. It wasn't. We knocked once. No answer. I looked at the officers and we went in. The smell reached me before anything else did, something chemical and sharp that had no business being inside a home. The living room told the rest of the story without words. A lamp knocked from its side table, my mother's cardigan on the floor in a crumpled pile. A dining chair turned at an angle that no one would leave on purpose. I had walked into enough disrupted spaces professionally to understand what fear leaves behind when it moves through a room quickly. This had that exact feeling. Hurried, frightened, recent. I heard my mother before I saw her. A thin, tight sound from the direction of the kitchen. I moved toward it. She was on the floor with her back against the cabinets, both arms wrapped around her knees. Across from her at the kitchen table with his arms folded and an expression cycling between irritation and forced innocence, sat a man named Dean Calloway. He was 41 years old, the husband of my cousin, and he had been pulling money from my parents for the better part of 6 years through a series of stories that kept needing new details to stay standing. I had come across his name once before, in a completely different context, minor financial fraud, a case that had been closed before it went anywhere. His name in a file I had never expected to connect to a family kitchen. He looked up when I came in with the officers. Something moved across his face. Recognition first, then recalculation, then an attempt at looking casual that did not land anywhere near casual. He said my name like he wasn't sure what to do with it. I didn't respond to him. Aunt Lorraine was in the back bedroom. She was sitting upright on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap and the expression of someone who had done the one necessary thing and was now simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly around her decision. When I came through the door, she looked at me and said very quietly that she knew I would understand the list. I sat down beside her. I took both her hands in mine. For a moment, I had no words, which is not something that happened to me often. She had trusted me across 9 years of silence with a grocery list, and she had been right to. She told me what had happened in the same calm, sequential way she told every story. Dean had arrived that afternoon with documents. He had been pressuring my parents for weeks to sign over access to a savings account my father had built over 30 years. When my father hesitated, Dean's voice had risen. When my mother reached for her phone, he had taken it from her. Aunt Lorraine had excused herself to the bedroom on the pretense of her blood pressure medication and sent me the list from the small backup phone she kept in her cardigan pocket. The one no one thought to check. The one connected to a signal she had written down in a notebook 9 years ago and, as it turned out, never forgotten at all. I went back to the kitchen. The officers were managing the formal process. I produced my credentials, the real ones, the ones I did not carry to family gatherings, and spoke with the senior officer for about 2 minutes. He looked at the credentials. He looked at Dean. The dynamic in that kitchen changed the way temperature changes when a window opens. Total, immediate, and impossible to reverse. Dean Calloway was removed from my parents' home in handcuffs 17 minutes after I had walked through the door. My mother watched from the hallway. She had a dish towel in both hands, wringing it slowly in that way she always did when she was keeping herself from falling apart in front of other people. After the front door closed, the house went very still. She turned and looked at me in a way she hadn't in years. Not with disappointment, not with that particular careful distance she'd maintained for over a decade. She looked at me the way you look at something you have been misreading for a long time and are only now beginning to see correctly. She said, "Claire, what is it that you actually do?" I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. I said, "Sit with me, Mom. I'll tell you what I'm allowed to." My father appeared in the doorway and sat without being asked. Robert Donovan, who had spent 12 years not quite looking at me, who had measured my worth against a standard I was never permitted to meet, sat down at his own kitchen table and looked uncertain in a way I had genuinely never seen on him. Like a man who had been adding up a long column of numbers and had just realized he'd been using the wrong total the whole time. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, he didn't ask about the credentials or the officers or the federal contractor whose name I still couldn't say out loud. He looked at me and asked how long I had been doing this. I told him 12 years. He nodded. He looked down at the table, and something moved through him that I didn't have a word for, something that looked less like pride and more like grief and relief arriving at the same moment. Which I think is what it feels like when you realize the story you've been telling yourself about someone was wrong in a way that cost both of you something real. Aunt Lorraine appeared in the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame with the satisfied expression of someone who had known exactly how this moment was going to arrive, long before any of the rest of us had gotten there. My mother reached across the table and took my hand without saying anything. My father cleared his throat once, then again, and said nothing. And from him, that was everything. I was 29 years old, and it took a coded grocery list, 2 police officers, and 12 years of silence for my family to finally see me clearly. But they saw me. And that, in the end, was enough.